Hey YouTube people, were you guys looking for some Zephyrus G14 2021 edition actual analysis and coverage? I've seen a few videos out there, mostly unboxings and kind of like, oh, the chrome's a little different, but let's go ahead and dive into the deep and real questions that you guys want answered. What we're going to look at today is a comparison between the 2020 G14, the 2021 G14, and the 2021 G15. We've got them all right here so we can answer the tough questions. First of all, one of the big things we're going to take a look at is performance between all of these models, but also, does the 2021 G14 have a 65 watt GPU or an 80 watt GPU? We know there's this dynamic boost thing that NVIDIA has been playing around with, but does it really work, and what does that mean for performance? How does it compare to the G15 and the G14 before it from 2020? And finally, we're going to look at that new 100 watt USB-C power delivery port on the Zephyrus G14 and see, can we actually play games while powering the device over that USB-C port? We're going to answer all these questions and dive deep into the analysis of this new machine and see if it's worth your money. Let's take a look. Here is the 2020 G14. And here's the new 2021 G14. And you'll see it has a little film underneath these little dots here. You can get it with the Anime Matrix display on the outside. This, of course, is just the Best Buy edition that does not have that. You can see the colors are a little warmer on the original G14. This is kind of a cooler, brighter white. Maybe that's just a plastic degrading, but this does seem a brighter white than this I ever remember this being. And if you were to look at these two devices side by side, you would probably be hard-pressed to tell any difference between them. They look exactly the same from the outside. They use the same power brick, and the only real difference is the color scheme and the fact that the new 2021 has this kind of burnt metal rainbow effect on it. And that's the real way to tell the difference between the two models. However, there are several upgrades to the 2021 Zephyrus G14. And let's talk about it. The first major thing is the fact that we now have a 144 hertz display versus 120 on the old one. The other big difference is the fact that you now have 100 watt power delivery versus 65 watt power delivery. Other minor changes include very minor keyboard layouts, which you can see here. The original had some media playback. On the new one, it's shifted to keyboard backlighting buttons and a new Aura button that lets you control the LEDs on the keyboard. I actually weighed these devices. The new G14 is ever so slightly a little bit lighter, but really there's no difference. Of course, the other difference that you would have between these devices is on the inside. These are both Best Buy devices. They both have 16 gigabytes of RAM, with one of them soldered in and one of them not. But the previous had the 2060 Max Q, and the new one has the 3060 Mobile. And we're dealing with a 4900 HS versus a 5900 HS. So those are the key differences. Now that we've got that out of the way, let's get to the real meat and potatoes of this video. And first question, is this a 65 watt GPU or an 80 watt GPU? Let's take a look. Okay, so the first question we're going to answer is this a 65 or an 80 watt GPU? Well, right off the bat, I have a meter here that's showing the wattage that the GPU is pulling. And you can see that right now it's right at around 70 watts, 71 watts, and it's kind of bouncing up between 60, now it's at 63 to 73. But mostly it's kind of hanging out between 65 and 72-ish as you watch the graph. we'll let that run for just a second. You may see it actually slow down as things kind of heat up. So yeah, we're bouncing around pretty good between 65 and 72. But I'm going to do a little trick here. The new Armory crate has given us more parameters that we can control. So let's go ahead and bump this down, and let's pretend that we're limiting the CPU to not pull up to 80 watts and only pull up to 20 watts. So let's go ahead and apply that and see what we're looking at now. You can see we just hit 76 watts. And you can see the red graph is actually peaking. We just hit 80 watts right there. So before, you kind of saw some peaks and valleys. Now with reducing the power envelope to the CPU, you can see this thing really is bumping between 72 and 80 watts on the graph, rather than bouncing around at 65 to 72. So we do have an increase in performance here just by capping our CPU. We're at 78 watts right here. Now, to contrast that to the 2020 version, the 2020 version was capped at 65 watts no matter what. This one, you can actually see that it is, in actuality, bumping around between 65 watts to 80 watts. And you can actually show that in a pretty well-defined manner by reducing the CPU usage. On the 2020 version, people did this to save on heat, and what they would do is actually use a Windows registry hack to allow you to disable the boost. Now, Armory Crate has given you the option to control the SPL and SPBT on the CPU, which lets you reduce the wattage that you want to make available to the CPU. Now, that can help in games like this one, where it's actually very GPU bound, not CPU bound. And we'll look at some benchmarks and comparisons there. But I just wanted to make sure and show you that yes, this GPU is absolutely capable of powering up to 80 watts. And you can see on average in this particular game, it is evening out at around 75 watts, but it can peak to 80. I've seen it do it, and the more room that you give this dynamic turbo by reducing CPU overhead, if you don't need it, you can increase performance pretty dramatically, and I'll show you what that means in just a second. So let's go ahead and close out of here and look at some benchmarks that I've already done. All right, everybody, let's take a look at the performance figures between the G14 2020 versus the 2021. Now we're going to compare these in their performance mode benchmark first. So let's look at Final Fantasy. The 2020 version scored 7816, and the 2021 version scored 8396. And keep in mind, these are all stock settings at performance. So that was a 7.42% increase. And if we look at the average watts that it pulled during that benchmark, it actually went down to 110 from 115, so it was actually a 4.35% reduction in average watts used. So those of you looking at this and saying, only 7.42% increase, like this was a 3060 and this was a 2060, like that sucks. Well, stay tuned. The full answer on the performance of this device is not answered quite yet. So just stay tuned, hang in there. All right, let's look at TimeSpy. The 2020 G14 in performance mode on TimeSpy scored 5,888, where the 2021 version scored 7,039. That was actually a 19.55% increase at the stock performance mode in Armory Crate. So TimeSpy, GPU 56 to 67, CPU 8149 to 8979, which was a 20% increase in GPU power in this benchmark, and 10.19% increase in CPU power.
And this extra power only came at the expense of an extra 2.04% power. So you can see it really depends on the benchmark you're running. But I have more to say about that Final Fantasy benchmark. Stay tuned. But you can see, wow, yeah, we're getting at least in the range of 7 to 20% improvement generationally by moving from the 2060 Max Q to the 3060 mobile. So let's look at Port Royal. Port Royal increased a massive 27%. The 2020 scored 3,201 and the 2021 scored 4,090. So another big number here. So now we're looking between 7% and almost 28% increase in performance. And that's before we've touched any of the tuning yet. So let's go ahead and look at the difference. I showed you guys how you could increase the GPU to hit 80 watts more frequently than the 65 watts it was kind of playing around at. And you do that by reducing the CPU wattage. So this is the change in performance that I got when I reduced the CPU to 30 watts in the Armory Crate settings, the manual settings. So at stock performance, in Port Royal we got 4,090, and by reducing the CPU to a 30 watt, we actually got a 3% increase. Port Royal is pretty GPU heavy anyways and doesn't really peg the CPU very much, so there's a little bit less of an increase here, probably because it was already pretty high. But take a look at this Final Fantasy 15 benchmark that we ran. The stock performance was 8,396, which we were like, it was only 7% improvement. Check it out. By simply capping the CPU at 30 watts, we boosted that score a full 8% up to 9,075. So that's the secret sauce, is you now have, rather than a fixed 65 watt GPU, you have a GPU that can bounce between 65 and 80 depending on the power requirements and the heat requirements. And that really is giving us a boost in the score, along with the improvements of moving from the 2000 series to the 3000 series. So look at this Final Fantasy benchmark. The GPU maximum watts when in the performance mode was 72, and now reducing the power available to the CPU, we're able to get 80. And that was a 11.11% increase in GPU power that resulted in an 8% performance improvement. Okay, so now let's go ahead, and what I did is, we compared stock to stock, but really, if you look at a 2020 G14 device that you have undervolted and tuned up, played with the memory, disabled boost, did everything I possibly could to get the best score that I could get out of my machine on the 2020. And then I did the same thing on the 2021. I did all the tweaks I could figure out. I added, 110 plus megahertz to the GPU and 200 megahertz on the memory. So by playing with parameters, these were the max scores I could get out of the devices. So this is 2020 G14 versus 2021 G14. So the 2020, with all the performance tweaks I could figure out to make it run faster, Final Fantasy pulled out an 8,083. But the 2021 version could pull out 9,408, which is a 16% improvement over the 2020 version. And if you look at Time Spy, same thing. You get a 24.35% improvement on a fully tuned G14 device comparing generationally. Let's move forward and let's look at how much. So this is now only looking at the 2020 G14, and I'm just showing you how much of a performance increase you could get by tuning your G14 in the 2020 model. Basically, you could get 3 to 5% extra performance by playing with your undervolting settings and reducing GPU boost. Reducing your CPU boost to get not have as much heat overtaking the graphics card. So you could only eke out, minimal extra performance by tuning it. Yeah, I know there's shunt mods and things like that, but within reason, you could eke out an extra 5, maybe 6% performance depending on the benchmark. But if you look at the 2021 G14 with the 3060 mobile and this dynamically adjusting wattage on the GPU, you actually, if you take the time to tune things up, can get a much bigger performance increase. So our Final Fantasy benchmark from stock to tuned on the 2021 version, we gained 12% and 12% in time spy. Port Royal, we didn't gain as much, and the reason for that is it's not very CPU intensive at all. It's all GPU, and when we ran it at stock, it was already boosting up to that 80 watt limit naturally. And by reducing the CPU wattage, it was already pretty low wattage in the first place. So we did get a gain of 3%, but not as big as the other ones. But you can see the 2021 is way more tunable if you take the time to play with it. And that's kind of what I wanted to express.
Okay, so now let's compare it for a minute to the 2021 G15. Now the 15-inch G15 is just a little bit bigger. It's a little less than a pound heavier. But let's take a look at the size comparison between the two, just so you can get a feel for what that might look like. And if we stand these up side by side like that, you can see it's about 1.5 inches taller and probably about almost 1 inch wider. The thickness, though, is pretty similar, although the G15 does have larger bumpers on the bottom to lift it off of the table. It also has 2 USB-C ports on the side and a built-in Ethernet cable, which could come in handy. And if we look at the other side, the G15 has a micro SD card reader and actually only has 1 USB port on this side, and where the G14 has its second USB-C on this side and 2 USB-A ports there. So fairly similar I/O. You get a few extra perks with the G15. One of them being the G15 actually has RGB lighted keys, and you can actually set these to do whatever you want. You can have them be static, breathing, change the color. They are RGB, where the G14 does not have RGB keys. And let's just get a quick shot of what these look like open before looking at the comparison details. The G15 as well, obviously you've got a 3070 in here if you go with the Best Buy editions, and the CPU is actually the same between the two, but you get a 165 Hz screen on this side, and this is only the 144 Hz screen. Both are really nice. The G14 definitely wins on portability. The G15, if I had to choose between the two, obviously if you want a 14-inch, this is your guy. 15-inch, this is your guy. The G15 does have that little bit extra oomph of performance. It has RGB lighted keys. The speakers are amazing on the G15. They really sound, the G14 aren't bad, but the G15 sounds really decent, really loud, and the screen is just beautiful on this thing. The G15 screen, super smooth. That 165 Hz is noticeable in my estimation. But with the 144 on the new 2021 G14, that's not as big of a detriment. But let's go ahead and take a look at the difference in performance between the G14 2021 and the G15 2021. All
right, the G14 versus the G15 2021. Final Fantasy benchmark score using stock settings on both of these, 8,396 versus 10,361. The G15 wins out with a 23.4% lead. Times by GPU goes from 6781 to 8950, 32% gain going from the G14 to the G15, and similar on Port Royal, 4000 to 5446, a 33.15% improvement. So keep in mind, this is the G14 at stock. We were able to boost performance by 12 to 13% by tweaking it, which would get it closer to the range of the G15. But pretty much in all situations, the G15, which you can also tweak and get more performance out of, but at stock settings, you can tweak the G14 to get close to the G15, but there's no way it's going to catch it. All right, let's answer the question, can you game on the 2021 Zephyrus G14 over USB-C? Well, you can see I'm powering over USB-C, and I have a little device here. You can see it's pulling 92 watts, and you can see that I'm pulling over or around 65 watts on the GPU. And what that means is I'm going basically full speed. In fact, if I were to play with my settings, I've seen that you can see at the beginning it was up over into the 70 watts. At this point, my benchmark is kind of slowed down here. And look, I just pulled a 7960 running off of USB-C. The problem is you're slowly going to lose power if you run full speed. You can see I started at 80%, I'm at 73% after running that benchmark. So the cool thing is it does not gimp the GPU if you're doing this over USB-C. But your battery's going to slowly drain. So the way to alleviate that is actually to open up Armory Crate and switch to the silent profile. Once you switch to the silent profile, this benchmark is going to cap at 45 watts. So normally this game pulls about 115 watts from the wall, but going over USB-C, you're maxing out at basically 90 to 95. But if you cap your GPU by moving it to silent mode, you're going to be able to game indefinitely. But to answer the question, yes, you can game full speed over 100 watt USB-C with the caveat that your battery may slowly drain. But there's ways around that. You can cap your GPU at a certain level, either by using the silent profile or by using MSI Afterburner. You can see right now I've capped it to 45 watts using silent mode, and that's going to allow me to run indefinitely over USB-C. So really cool that they now let you do this, because the 2020 version did not do this. The GPU kind of gimped itself if you were powering over USB-C. So awesome to see. So thanks for watching the video. I hope this gives you some clear insight onto what the 2021 Zephyrus G14 can do. Sorry there's a little bit of audio issues in some of those clips. I've got a problem I need to work out there, but I wanted to get this video out for you guys to be able to see. So if you like this analysis, go ahead and subscribe for getting you this content that you're not seeing anywhere else, and we'll see you on the next one.